What happens when the system you've spent your life upholding turns on you? Jamal Winslow, a seasoned assistant U.S. attorney, was on his way home after a dinner with colleagues. The night in Baton Rouge was still and calm, just another uneventful evening, or so it seemed. Then came the flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. He wasn't speeding. He wasn't breaking any laws. But that didn't matter. Jamal knew better than to believe this was just a routine stop. He pulled over, hoping for a quick resolution. But the moment two officers approached his car, everything shifted. Officer Kyle Driscoll, tall, imposing, and carrying an air of quiet arrogance, leaned in with a clipped license and registration. His partner, Officer Brent Kessler, stood by the passenger door, waiting like a shadow. "May I ask why I was stopped?" Jamal asked, keeping his voice even. "Your tail lights out," Driscoll answered, eyes narrowing slightly as if daring Jamal to challenge him. But Jamal's car had just passed inspection. The tail lights were fine. He frowned. "Are you sure about that?" Driscoll glanced briefly at Kessler, then leaned in closer, his voice taking on a colder edge. "Step out of the vehicle." Jamal's heart began to race. He'd dealt with cases like this before, where a routine traffic stop suddenly turned hostile. But this was different. This was happening to him. "I'm not stepping out until you tell me why," Jamal replied, his voice calm but firm. He knew his rights. He knew this wasn't right. Kessler smirked, resting his hand on his belt, an open challenge in his posture. "Because we said so." Something about their tone, their confidence that they could do whatever they wanted, lit a fire inside Jamal. He had spent his career fighting for justice, wasn't about to let this stand. "I'm within my rights to ask why," he said, eyes locked on Driscoll. In an instant, Driscoll's demeanor shifted. The door flew open, and before Jamal could react, the officer grabbed his wrist, yanking him out of the car. The seatbelt caught around his chest, digging into his shoulder. "What the hell are you doing?" Jamal barked, trying to pull back. But the officers were faster. Kessler grabbed his arm, wrenching it behind his back, the cuffs biting into his skin. "You're resisting," Driscoll said coldly. Jamal's mind whirled. Was this really happening? Was he really being arrested for something he didn't do? This wasn't just a stop. This was a setup. This version gets right into the conflict, making it clear that Jamal is someone who knows the law and understands the stakes, but he's caught in a moment where the system he's worked for is being used against him. The hook engages the reader by presenting an injustice that's immediate, personal, and intense. The stakes are clear from the first paragraph, compelling readers to read on and find out what happens next. Jamal Winslow sat in the East Baton Rouge Parish Courthouse, his back straight, his mind laser-focused. The courtroom, despite its routine appearance papers rustling, the low murmur of lawyers negotiating minor details was anything but ordinary for him. Jamal wasn't here today as a prosecutor. He wasn't the one in charge of justice. No, today he sat at the defendant's table, facing charges of resisting arrest, obstruction, and disorderly conduct charges that were as fabricated as the entire arrest. He had spent years working in law enforcement, prosecuting cases just like the one that had brought him here today. He'd spent countless hours studying the law, enforcing it, defending it. But in the twisted reality he found himself in now, Jamal realized that even the law couldn't protect him, not from the people who were supposed to uphold it. Judge Margaret Holloway, a no-nonsense figure in her mid-60s, barely glanced in Jamal's direction. Her reputation as someone who swiftly dismissed cases without a second thought had already preceded her, and Jamal knew what he was up against. Holloway had been a fixture in the court for years, and her impartiality was as questionable as the prosecutors she oversaw. She was the kind of judge who didn't hesitate to side with the police, even when the facts didn't back them up. As the prosecution took their turn, Richard Callawaylan, confident and brimming with the kind of arrogance that comes from knowing the system, had his back stood before the jury. His opening statement was sharp, methodical, and dripping with conviction. "This is a simple case of a defendant escalating a routine traffic stop into a physical confrontation," he said, his voice calm, measured, and laced with authority. Mr. Winslow refused to comply with lawful orders, and his aggression forced officers to take action for the safety of all involved. Jamal's stomach churned at the words. He knew the truth. The officers had lied. They had pulled him over under false pretenses and escalated the situation from the moment they laid hands on him. The story Calloway was spinning wasn't just wrong, it was dangerous. This wasn't a routine traffic stop, it was a case of abuse of power, plain and simple. But there was no body cam footage to back up his claim, no dash cam to prove what had really happened. It was his word against theirs. The prosecutor continued, detailing Jamal's supposed refusal to comply, the so-called escalation, and the moment he allegedly became violent. Every word that left his mouth was more of the same fabrication after fabrication. Jamal felt his blood boil as he listened. He had been the one who had been violated, the one whose rights had been trampled. But here he was, sitting as the accused, while the officers who had wrongfully arrested him stood confidently on the other side of the courtroom. Jamal's public defender, Thomas Rivera, was doing his best, but it was clear that he was out of his depth. Rivera was an overworked and underpaid public defender, his years of experience battling to keep his clients out of the system barely matching up to the heavyweights on the other side. He shot up from his chair as Calloway finished speaking, the frustration in his voice palpable. "Objection, Your Honor. There is no evidence that my client was aggressive. The officer's statements are nothing but hearsay." Judge Holloway waved her hand dismissively, signaling that the objection had been overruled without a second thought. Jamal could almost feel the scales tipping further away from justice. His lawyer's efforts, as feeble as they were, seemed like a losing battle from the start. The judge wasn't interested in fairness. She was interested in following protocol, and that meant siding with the officers who had far more authority in this room than he did. Then came the officers. First, Officer Kyle Driscoll, the one who had initiated the physical confrontation, took the stand. His demeanor was polished, rehearsed. His words came out smooth, calculated. "The defendant refused to exit the vehicle," Driscoll said, his voice cold and firm. He raised his voice, refused to comply, and became hostile. "We feared for our safety, and we had to restrain him." Jamal's heart pounded in his chest as Driscoll spoke. The words were Lee's every single one of them. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't resisted. He had merely asked why he was being pulled over. He had done everything by the book. And yet, here he was, painted as the aggressor. Kessler, the second officer, echoed Driscoll's testimony, adding his own touch of falsehood. "He tensed up, seemed defensive," Kessler claimed. "We had no choice but to restrain him. It was a performance." And Jamal had to admit, they were good at it. They had rehearsed this, and they had the system's backing. But Jamal wasn't backing down. He wasn't going to let their lies stand unchallenged. Jamal's lawyer, Rivera, stood again, though his voice was quieter, less certain. He raised his objection to the lack of evidence backing up the officer's claims, but his protest was quickly dismissed. It didn't matter. Rivera wasn't going to win this case in a courtroom like this. Jamal knew it was up to him to make his stand. He had fought cases like this for years, helping others defend their rights, but now it was his turn. When the judge gave him the go-ahead to testify, Jamal stood tall, his back straight. The room was silent, every eye on him. He didn't feel the weight of the gavel, but he felt the weight of the lies stacked against him. His turn had come. Jamal walked to the witness stand, his heart steady but his mind racing. This was the moment. He was going to speak the truth not just for himself, but for everyone who had been wronged by a system built on lies and power. When Calloway approached, he wasted no time with pleasantries. "Mr. Winslow," he began, "would you say you complied with the officer's instructions during the traffic stop?" Jamal met his gaze without hesitation. "I asked why I was being ordered out of my vehicle," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. "That's not illegal." Calloway's face flickered with annoyance. "You refused to exit the vehicle despite multiple orders," he said, shaking his head in feigned disappointment. Jamal leaned forward, his voice even but firm. "There was no lawful reason for me to step out of the car. I was asking a question. That's my right." The prosecutor's smirk faltered, and for a brief moment, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Then, Jamal did something that would change everything. Before Calloway could respond, Jamal reached into his briefcase, pulling out a small, simple badge. The room went quiet, and Jamal's voice cut through the tension like a razor. "I'm Jamal Winslow," he said, his voice commanding, "Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Louisiana." The moment the words left his mouth, the entire room shifted. Calloway's expression faltered, his confident posture slipping. The officer's smugness disappeared. Judge Holloway's gaze, which had been indifferent up until now, locked onto Jamal with a newfound seriousness. Even Rivera, his own lawyer, looked taken aback. Jamal's revelation didn't just expose the lies, it shook the foundations of the entire courtroom. In that moment, Jamal Winslow was no longer just the defendant. He was the one who held the power to expose the truth, and the entire system was on notice. Jamal's revelation rocked the courtroom. For a brief moment, everything seemed suspended in time, like the very air was thick with disbelief. The prosecutor, Richard Calloway, blinked, his well-rehearsed facade faltering. The officers, who moments ago had been so confident in their false claims, now exchanged nervous glances. Even Judge Holloway's usually unshakable demeanor wavered. The weight of Jamal's words settled over the room, hanging like a cloud. Assistant U.S. Attorney. The implications of that simple title were immediate and severe. It wasn't just that Jamal had credentials. It was that the system, the very law he had once fought to uphold, had betrayed him. And now, the truth was coming to light. Jamal felt a quiet sense of relief. The momentary shock that rippled through the courtroom wasn't just about the revelation of his position, it was about the truth finally breaking through. He had been walking in the shadow of lies for so long, and now he was shining a light on them. "Mr. Winslow," Judge Holloway finally spoke, her voice colder than before. "Are you implying that you've been treated unfairly because of your position?" "I'm not implying anything, Your Honor," Jamal replied, his voice firm but steady. "I'm stating the facts. The officers violated my rights. They pulled me over without probable cause and escalated the situation for no reason other than their own aggression. I have been wronged, not just as a citizen, but as someone who has spent years upholding the law." A silence fell over the room. Calloway stood motionless for a moment, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to find the right words, but failing to do so. The officers' faces were unreadable, now less sure, less confident. The once strong case they had presented was beginning to unravel. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss these charges." Jamal's lawyer, Thomas Rivera, finally spoke, his voice rising with newfound vigor. "There is no evidence to support the prosecution's claims. The officers' testimonies have been shown to be fabricated, and now it's clear that Mr. Winslow's position should have given him the respect and protection he deserves, not the treatment of a common criminal." The judge didn't respond immediately. She merely glanced down at the papers in front of her, her pen moving in practiced, methodical motions. The tension in the room was palpable, everyone waiting for her decision. Calloway stepped forward, his voice clipped and defensive. "Your Honor, I would like to request a recess to confer with my colleagues. The defendant's sudden claim has raised serious questions, and I need time to reassess our position." Judge Holloway didn't hesitate, nodding in agreement. "We'll reconvene in 30 minutes, she said, her voice still carrying the weight of authority. "Until then, the defendant will remain in custody. Mr. Winslow, I expect you to cooperate." The statement stung. Jamal had just exposed the officers for their lies, yet he was still treated as if he were the problem. Still, he kept his composure, nodding respectfully as he was led back to his seat. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, but he didn't flinch. He wasn't about to let this setback derail his pursuit of justice. As the court adjourned for the recess, Jamal was escorted back to the holding area. There, he sat in a small, cold cell, alone with his thoughts. The adrenaline from the courtroom still buzzed in his system, but his mind was already turning, calculating the next steps. What had just happened was a small victory, but the real battle was far from over. He knew that exposing the truth would only make him a target, and that people in power, people who had spent their careers burying the truth, weren't going to back down easily. But Jamal wasn't about to let that stop him. He had spent too long in the system to be silenced now. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. It read, "You don't want to be doing this, Jamal. Drop the case and walk away. The consequences won't be pretty." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. The message was clear, it was a threat, but he wasn't afraid. He'd been threatened before, and it had never stopped him. If anything, it only made him more determined. He didn't respond to the message. Instead, he locked his phone and set it down on the bench beside him. Jamal knew what he was up against. But more importantly, he knew that this wasn't just about his case anymore. This was bigger than him. This was about holding a system accountable, about showing that no one was above the law, not even those who had the power to enforce it. His lawyer, Rivera, arrived shortly before the recess ended. The look on his face was one of frustration mixed with a hint of hope. "They're not backing down," Rivera said quietly, lowering his voice as he sat down next to Jamal. "But we've got something on them now, and it's enough to start peeling back the layers. You've shaken their confidence. That's a good sign." Jamal nodded. "But we have to be careful. They'll fight dirty. This isn't just about the case anymore. This is about power and the people who are going to try to protect it. I'm not just fighting for me. I'm fighting for everyone who's ever been mistreated by the system." Rivera sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I know, and I'm with you, Jamal. But we need to stay focused. We need evidence. Real, irrefutable evidence. Right now, it's your word against theirs." Jamal leaned forward, his eyes focused. "I know, but we'll find it. We have to." As the recess ended, the courtroom doors opened, and Jamal stood to face whatever came next. The fight was far from over, but this was the moment he had been waiting for. The truth was out. Now, it was time to make sure that those who had lied would be held accountable. When Jamal re-entered the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. The prosecutor looked rattled, but still determined. The officers stood with their heads slightly lowered, clearly shaken by what had happened, but none of them were backing down, not yet. Jamal knew the battle was just beginning, but he wasn't going to stop. Not now, not when everything he had worked for, everything he had believed in, was on the line. The courtroom buzzed with a tension that had become almost unbearable. The brief recess hadn't done anything to quell the uncertainty hanging in the air. Jamal sat tall in his chair, feeling the weight of the entire room on his shoulders. Everyone had their eyes on him now, waiting for his next move. The officers who had falsely accused him, the prosecutor who had miscalculated his approach, the judge whose decision would either hold him back or propel him forward. And Jamal knew one thing. He couldn't afford to lose this battle. "Mr. Winslow," Judge Holloway's voice cut through the murmur in the room. "You may proceed with your defense." Jamal rose from his seat, his mind racing. This was it, the moment he had been preparing for. He had to continue pushing, to expose the truth no matter how deep the conspiracy went. "Your Honor," he began, his voice clear and steady, "I understand that there are those in this courtroom who would like to dismiss my claims as just the desperate words of a man trying to protect himself from the truth. But I stand before you not just as a defendant, but as a man who has spent his entire life serving the law. I know how it works. I know how it's supposed to work. And I can tell you with certainty that the actions of the officers that night were not just unlawful, they were deliberate." A murmur rippled through the audience, but Jamal didn't pause. He could feel the eyes of the prosecutor on him, probing, waiting for him to falter. But there was no room for hesitation. This wasn't about him anymore. This was about everyone who had ever been caught in the web of corruption and power misuse, and he wasn't about to let them get away with it. "I'm not just talking about the traffic stop," Jamal continued. "I'm talking about everything that led to it. The misinformation, the manipulation, the way this case was handled from the start. When I was pulled over, the officers had no reasonable suspicion. The stop was unlawful, but that's not the point. The point is that I wasn't just another black man on the street that night. I wasn't just some statistic in their eyes. I was someone who knew the system, someone who had worked with it, someone they should have respected, and yet they chose to treat me like an enemy." The courtroom was silent. Jamal's words were not just a defense, they were a revelation. He was not just fighting for his innocence, he was fighting for justice. And for the first time in a long while, he could feel the power shift. The officers who had once stood tall in their lies were shrinking, their arrogance giving way to uncertainty. But there was still more to be said. Jamal needed to dig deeper, to uncover the rot that lay beneath the surface. If they were going to bring him down, They had to bring everything down, and he had the truth on his side. I ask you, Your Honor, to consider what I'm about to say carefully. Jamal's voice lowered, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. I know who's behind this. I know that this isn't just a case of rogue officers making bad decisions. This was orchestrated. The corruption runs deeper than you realize. There was a moment of stillness before Calloway stood abruptly, his voice rising in protest. Objection, Your Honor. This is pure speculation. Mr. Winslow is making baseless accusations without any evidence to support them. Judge Holloway's eyes flicked to Calloway, then back to Jamal. Sustained. Mr. Winslow, please stick to the facts. Jamal met her gaze without flinching. He wasn't about to back down. With all due respect, Your Honor, the facts are right in front of you. The officers' testimonies were fabricated. The charges against me were built on lies. But there's something more sinister at play here. Something that goes beyond a simple case of mistaken identity or police error. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The silence in the room was thick. He could feel the energy shift again, people waiting for him to reveal the next piece of the puzzle. I have reason to believe that this case is part of a much larger scheme, Jamal continued, his voice rising with growing conviction. A scheme that involves powerful figures in law enforcement who have been covering up misconduct, who have been protecting each other. And I'm not just talking about the local level. I'm talking about people who are embedded in the very heart of the justice system. Gasps echoed around the room, and Judge Holloway's eyes narrowed. Calloway was visibly flustered now, sweating slightly as he glanced at the officers who were seated nearby. The game was changing. And Jamal was taking control. I don't expect you to believe me right now, Jamal said, but I can promise you this. I'm not the only one who has seen this. There are others who know. Others who have been silenced, threatened, intimidated into keeping quiet. But no more. I won't be silenced, and I won't let you bury the truth. For a moment, Jamal allowed the courtroom to settle into an uneasy stillness. This wasn't just about the traffic stop. This was about an entire system of corruption that had been built on secrecy, lies, and fear, and he wasn't going to let it stand. Calloway seemed to recover, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed his discomfort. Your Honor, I request that Mr. Winslow's statements be stricken from the record. They are completely unfounded and only serve to derail the proceedings. Judge Holloway considered this for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke. Mr. Winslow, she said, I have warned you about speculative statements. However, your accusations have raised serious concerns. I will not disregard them outright. I am ordering an independent investigation into your claims. If there is truth to what you're saying, we will ensure that it is addressed. Jamal's heart raced. He knew this was a breakthrough, but it was just the beginning. The investigation would be a battle in itself, one that would expose the web of lies and corruption that had ensnared him. He had to be careful, though people with power didn't lose easily, and there would be those who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets safe. Thank you, Your Honor, Jamal said, his voice calm but determined. He turned to face the room, knowing that this moment was just the beginning. His fight for justice was no longer just about clearing his name. It was about bringing down the system that had allowed this corruption to flourish, and he would do whatever it took to make sure the truth came to light. As he sat down, his lawyer Rivera leaned over and whispered, You just set the stage for something bigger, Jamal. They're going to come after you now harder than ever. But you're not alone in this. Jamal nodded. I know, and I'm not stopping until every last piece of this puzzle is put together. The days following the courtroom session were a whirlwind. Jamal had been prepared for pushback, but he hadn't anticipated how quickly the system would turn against him. The independent investigation he had demanded was now underway, but the pressure was mounting in ways he hadn't expected. Every corner of his life seemed to be under scrutiny. He felt it in the way people looked at him on the street, the whispers behind closed doors. He was under a microscope. He and his lawyer, Rivera, spent long hours reviewing documents, trying to find anything that could further support his claims. Jamal wasn't naive. He knew how quickly power could silence the truth. But this time, he wasn't going down without a fight. He was determined to expose the corruption, no matter the cost. It wasn't just for him anymore, it was for everyone who had been wronged by the system. One night, as he sat at his desk going through case files, Rivera burst into the office, his face pale and his eyes wide with urgency. "Jamal, you need to see this," Rivera said, holding out a manila folder that seemed to radiate tension. Jamal stood up quickly, his pulse quickening. "What is it?" Rivera placed the folder on the desk and flipped it open, revealing a series of photos. Jamal leaned in, his stomach tightening as he recognized the officers who had been involved in his arrest. But what shocked him were the photos of those same officers with high-ranking officials people Jamal had only seen on television or in the news. They were meeting in a darkened room discussing something with an air of secrecy. One of the officers was holding a piece of paper, and the others were looking at it intently. "This," Rivera said, voice low, "is what we've been looking for. It's not just a case of corruption, it's a full-blown cover-up. These officers aren't acting alone. They've been receiving orders from the very top." Jamal's heart raced. This was the smoking gun they had been hoping for, the evidence that could break the entire case wide open. But there was a problem. These weren't just any officials. These were people with influence, people who would stop at nothing to protect their own. Jamal knew that exposing this could make him a target. He took a deep breath and pushed the photos back into the folder. "We need to take this to the investigators. Now." The next few days were a blur of meetings, strategy sessions, and phone calls. The investigation into the corruption within the police force was advancing, but with each new revelation, the stakes grew higher. Jamal's name was being whispered in the halls of power. It was clear that the forces against him were rallying, determined to maintain the status quo. But Jamal couldn't back down. This wasn't just about his personal fight anymore. It was about breaking a system that had allowed corruption to thrive for far too long. He had made a choice when he stood in that courtroom, demanding the truth, and he wasn't going to stop now. He and Rivera continued to work tirelessly, trying to stay one step ahead of those who would do anything to shut them down. But the threats began to escalate. Strange cars began following Jamal, and he received anonymous phone calls warning him to stay quiet. Rivera, too, found himself in increasingly dangerous situations. One evening, as he walked to his car after a meeting, he was accosted by a group of men who told him to leave the case alone. A veiled threat, but one that was clear enough. Still, neither of them flinched. They knew the risks, and they were prepared to take them. Then, on the morning of the final hearing, everything came to a head. The courtroom was packed, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. The prosecution had spent weeks discrediting Jamal, trying to paint him as a disgruntled former officer who was making baseless accusations. But Jamal wasn't there to play their game. He had one last card to play on that would force the truth into the light. As the hearing began, Jamal took the stand, his heart pounding in his chest. He had prepared for this moment, but now that it was here, it felt as though the weight of the world was pressing down on him. "Mr. Winslow," the prosecutor began, "you've made some very serious allegations against high-ranking members of the justice system. Do you have anything concrete to support your claims?" Jamal stood up, meeting the prosecutor's gaze. He wasn't intimidated anymore. He wasn't backing down. "Your Honor, I don't just have claims," Jamal said, his voice steady. "I have evidence." He looked over at Rivera, who was sitting in the front row. Rivera nodded, and the final set of documents was handed over to the judge. "These documents will show exactly who was involved in this cover-up, and they will prove that this case has been a carefully orchestrated attempt to destroy my life and reputation." The room went silent as the judge began to review the documents. Jamal's pulse raced as the tension built. For a moment, it felt like the world had stopped. He had done everything he could. Now, it was out of his hands. The judge looked up from the papers, her expression unreadable. "I believe this warrants a full investigation," she said. "I will be contacting the relevant authorities to look into these claims immediately. For now, this trial is adjourned." Jamal felt a wave of relief wash over him, though he knew this was only the beginning. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot, but the tide had turned. The truth was out there now, and there would be no way to put it back. Weeks later, the investigation into the police corruption reached a head. Several high-ranking officials were arrested, and the officers who had framed Jamal were placed under investigation. The story hit the news, and for the first time in years, people were beginning to ask questions. The system was starting to crack, and Jamal was at the center of it. As Jamal walked out of the courthouse that day, a sense of peace settled over him. He had fought for what was right, and though the battle had been long and painful, he had won. Not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been wronged by the system. The truth had come to light, and nothing could take that away. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. He had changed the course of history, and that was worth any price. The fight was far from over, but Jamal was ready.